again, this is not reinventing the wheel, but to ensure that there is a thorough scientific process to identify MPAs and to really allow different methods to doing so. In specific context of the CAMLR, I think it is important that at some point there needs to be an agreement that all the best available science has been used, because that's sometimes nevertheless used as a stalling mechanism, or really then saying, okay, what else do you need at this stage to take a decision? And often then the answers are becoming rarer. So I think in the context of CAMLR, it was important for certain proposals just to have the tick off from the scientific community, say, yes, this is based on best available science. And then also for any MPA proposal to be really clear on its objectives, and to sort of bring this into the context of is fishing a threat for this particular objective or not. And my last slide is sort of also the need for really to happen this in an environment of transparency and trust, because there are high stakes in it, there are economic gains in this as well. So I think it is really the fact that CAMLR, in my view at least, has this adaptation and review process. It really shows that, you know, let's see where we can go, and if the objectives are really really reached by the measure we took. And I put this other bullet in there to just, I guess, more in the context of CAMLR, the Southern Ocean, and the Arctic, but a question of really the fishing. Is there a need for the fishing, or to go in such a bigger extent in the sense of who's getting the fish, a question of equity, to sort of just maybe trigger some reactions to that. And then just sort of as the last slide, as I mentioned before as well, and I think it was mentioned in the opening remarks, MPAs cannot be the ultimate objective. It's really the sort of how do we manage the ocean in a coherent manner, and MPAs is one tool in this common toolbox. And yeah, and the need for collaboration with other forums. Anyway, that's it.
That's it. Thanks very much, Dorothy. Okay, so the way we thought, we have about a half an hour left, and we thought first we'd take any questions for the last two speakers, and then we want to have, maybe Lisa and I'll lead this discussion about lessons learned and crossovers and stuff. So do we have any questions for the last two speakers? Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Udo Stoman, and I'm from Chile. And let me understand one thing properly with regard of the fishing, commercial fishing in Antarctica. I thought that the Ross Sea, it's south 60 degrees latitude, so it's part of the Antarctic Treaty.
Yeah.
I'm okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, and Dorothy was telling about the areas outside the 60 degrees. It means area covered by the CAMLR, the conventional.
CAMLR covers
all the Antarctic convergent waters.
Not all, but it goes up near the convergence, and there's some cutouts for the EEZs and so forth.
And my question is with regard of the who has, or which country or which fleet of vessels are allowed to go to do this commercial fishing in Antarctica, and where those revenues goes and so on. It's unclarified for me. I always thought that those were completely protected, and now I didn't.
No, a lot of us wish that were true, but the bottom line is that this CAMLR Commission that was mentioned. Thank you. The CAMLR Commission every year receives proposals from different countries on behalf of their fishing companies. That's how it normally works. And the scientific committee reviews the proposals and gives advice, and on the basis of that advice, but often politics, as Dorothy mentioned, they decide to give licenses. The licenses can be exploratory licenses, they can be kind of test fishing licenses, they can be fully commercial licenses. They have several different categories of licenses. They set catch limits. There are sophisticated rules about vessel monitoring equipment so that the CAMLR Secretariat can keep track of who's fishing where and do they go over their targets and so forth. But it's sadly not the case that all of it's protected. And as time has gone on, when CAMLR started in 1982, the great majority of the states involved were not fishing. But today, the great majority, in fact, virtually all of the states are fishing, or else they have a desire to fish. So it's changed the balance politically inside this commission, and not for the betterment of conservation. So it makes the decision-making process quite complicated. And one thing to keep in mind is the decisions are taken by consensus. It doesn't mean everybody has to raise their hand and say yes to a conservation measure, but no country can raise its flag and say no. So there's kind of a least common denominator effect in some cases. And what happened in the Ross Sea, just to be clear about that, is that it's still not a fully assessed commercial fishery under strict CAMLR rules. It's a kind of a test fishery, you could say. But in fact, it operates just like a commercial fishery. And now there's 7 or 8 countries involved, and they have a lot of political power, and their interests are not necessarily in favor of having these MPAs. So it can be a big struggle to get these MPAs forward.
Just adding to the point of sort of what has to happen outside of the MPA, I think I should have come across that CAMLR is, with regards to living marine resources, and there's a whole Antarctic treaty system around it. For example, looking also at tourism, etc. So I think that was the point of saying, although CAMLR and its MPA has just a jurisdiction on fisheries, that there might be other impacts or human activities that might impact the objective of a specific MPAs, and why there needs to be some close collaboration between the different elements of this system. And some of this is already happening, but just sort of emphasizing that that's an important part, because you might otherwise get the objective not reached because of outside influences.
Another question for one of our last 2 speakers? Okay, yes, there's one back here.
Sorry to come back again.
No worries.
On one of your slides, you mentioned that working on a collective GIF database is proposed. Now, I'm a little bit surprised by this, and I would like to hear from you some clarification on what sort of database you're envisaging, considering that there's a tremendous work being done on precisely publishing biodiversity data of the Antarctic, thinking about Global Change Master Directory that contains a lot of information. UNTABIF contains a tremendous amount of information, Scal Marvin and the likes. So what exactly do you propose as a database here?
Just to clarify, I'm not proposing it. I'm just saying that there are members, and I think this was an idea that came from the UK, and that was out of, I think, the last MPA workshop, if I'm not mistaken. So I can definitely put you in touch with the people who can tell you in much more detail what this database ought to be doing.
Any more questions for the last 2 speakers? Okay, then I think I'd like to ask all the speakers to come and sit up at the table, and then we're going to try to, Lisa, would you help me lead this next section up here? What we're hoping to do is to look ahead, think of some lessons that might be, Lisa, you come up with me over here. There's plenty of chairs. We'd like to have a dialogue, a discussion with the group, and hear your ideas, and we want to ask some of the panel members their ideas. I know they've been thinking about this a little bit. How can we strengthen both sides of the polar equation, so to speak, to advance conservation goals? What kind of lessons might we say can be or have been or could be learned, etc.? And do you want to say something else to start this off? Or
Sure. So when people think about the Arctic and the Antarctic, they think they're both cold, they both have ice. They mistakenly think that penguins occur in the north and polar bears in the south, but they don't really think about the massive differences between the 2 poles you know, you've got land surrounded by water in Antarctica, water surrounded by land in the Arctic. 4 million people live in the Arctic. Nobody lives really other than the scientists in the Antarctic. So they're really vast differences. But even with those differences, it seems to me that there are very important ways that these two systems are linked. Biologically, through the shared species. Martha McConnell was telling us this morning that there are over 200 species that occur at both poles. There are species that migrate between the two poles. There are very similar issues in terms of melting, at least in some places in Antarctica, as there is in the Arctic. So there's some commonalities there that we hope to stimulate a discussion with you about how we might learn from each other in terms of the experiences. And I think the Antarctic appears, from an Arctic person, to be much further ahead. So we in particular need your wisdom and advice on how to proceed in implementing the things that Dorothy and Claire talked about on protected areas, ecosystem-based management, etc.
So my first idea is I want to ask Neil Gilbert, who knows a lot about the Antarctic system, if he would take a shot at launching this discussion. Would you do that, Neil?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jim, for the invitation, and thank you to all the speakers. I'm going to launch, actually, one issue that I wanted to raise anyway, and just responding, I think, to the last few comments about some of the differences and similarities between the polar regions. One of the differences that greatly concerns me, and I've seen both. I was also the UK observer to the Arctic Council in a previous life, so I've seen sort of both regimes in operation. One of the significant differences that worries me is the amount of investment. And I've heard David calling for greater investment into Arctic initiatives, and I understand that. And yet, in an Antarctic context, I would suggest that we're actually the poor cousin. And despite the comment that was just made about the lessons that could be learned from the Antarctic, yes, we have a regime, but we have substantially less investment that's going on to initiatives and projects in the Antarctic than I see that's emerging from the Arctic, where I see a great range of initiatives that are being very well funded and supported, and so they should, quite rightly so. And yet the challenges we're facing in an Antarctic context, I would say, are in parallel, but less well supported and at the moment, at least from the funding. So that starts us off on the conversation.
Okay. And can I ask our panel members to, well, you can respond to that, or you can pick up the ball and say whatever you want to in this segment. So who wants to go first? David?
Yeah, there's just so many differences. I mean, the human population reality in the Arctic with indigenous populations, for example, where you have, you know, transient kind of residents in the Antarctic. The whole, I guess, status of the Antarctic with a moratorium on minerals development. Again, you don't have that in the Arctic, and you have great investments that are coming. We can see it, particularly off the Russian Federation, etc. And then this whole question of jurisdiction. In the Arctic, you have the coastal states. No one questions their jurisdiction. They all have their jurisdiction up to 200 nautical miles. It will get extended out on these extended continental shelves as well. Again, where are we in the Antarctic? Well, you have a freezing on the claims, so the 7 claimant states, and so you don't have any clear coastal state jurisdiction. That's why you end up having CAMLR, because you need some kind of management regime. In the Arctic, largely is going to fall under the coastal state jurisdiction. So I guess that's where you really have a difficult, lessons to be learned. I think this idea of sharing experiences, particularly on how you move MPAs ahead, really came out this morning to me. It seems like we're so far advanced in the Antarctic versus the Arctic. And so again, I think there could be maybe a lot of lessons to be learned in processes, institutional mechanisms, in certain ways, how tourism's dealt with, again, those commonalities. And I think the Antarctic actually is ahead of the Arctic there. Again, partly because it falls under coastal state jurisdiction largely in the Arctic. But coastal states in the Arctic are not very advanced, I think, in looking at tourism policy and where it should go and some of the limits. And you might learn from the Antarctic some of the limits that might be put on it. Those are a couple initial thoughts.
Caleb? Who wants to go next? Dorothy?
Well, sort of being involved both in Arctic and Arctic. And I think as Lisa clearly states, the Antarctic is in many ways further advanced and ahead of it. But I think hearing now, for example, about the proposal by the Swedish government to sort of look at how nevertheless this network of MPAs could be developed, I think that is sort of maybe the next step that is needed to bring it up a ladder on official, sort of recognition, because I think NRDC, NIUCN, and others have done a great sort of job of getting the ball rolling. And I think the CAMLR context shows that nevertheless at the end you need this political buy-in and the political support. And although the legal system is different, I think it is those kind of steps that will bring the bigger, in the end, the steps you need to designate and implement it, under whatever legal form it will be in the end. Yeah, so I think that's a bit from looking at the process per se, what CAMLR did in getting towards an MPA network, and sort of using that a bit, modeling it a bit so it can fit within the Arctic context.
Let me just push that a little bit further. So Sweden has this idea, let's assume it goes forward, that they have some workshops to identify the places that deserve protection. But what is the actual mechanism going to be to create these protected areas, given the fact that there's no overarching framework, et cetera? Does anybody have some thoughts on how that can work?
That's a $64,000 question. Most of the areas are within national jurisdiction, and so it will be up to the individual countries to decide how they want to manage those areas. There is an effort going on that was started under the leadership of the United States at the last Arctic Ministerial in 2011 that is establishing a program to share information and experience on ecosystem-based management. And the idea here is not to create an Antarctic-like system where some governing body tells all the different countries what they have to do within their waters, but instead to share experiences, to bring different countries along in how to manage ecosystems, including protected areas, but not limited to protected areas. Because the reality is in the Arctic that activities in one country's waters can affect the resources in another's. I mean, it's because we know from Sarah Palin, you can see, as Caleb said, you can see Russia from Alaska. You have to have some sort of coordination, and it would be helpful if the Arctic countries were to move together in some respects, recognizing that they have sovereignty over their waters. So it's not the same kind of situation in the Antarctic, but I still think that we can learn from the experiences that you guys have had down there in advancing the concepts of EBM, even though the implementation will be very different. I just want to address the investment question. The reality is there are 4 million people living in the Arctic. People invest where people are, and if you've got a quarter of the world's oil and gas, and potential mining, and potential fisheries, and a huge wealth of industrial activity potentially up there, that drives a lot of investment. So be careful what you wish for.
I'd like to hear what people think about the possibility, in spite of the different governance structure, could there be a region-wide scientific advisory council of some kind that is kind of a mirror of CAMLR, that draws on the expertise of all the Arctic states and the observer states that are interested, and forms itself kind of a scientific forum that can, let's call it, independently give advice, or give independent advice to the governments that might help move the ball forward in various ways.
Elizabeth. Sure.
Elizabeth McClanahan with the U.S. government, and I'm very active in the Arctic Ocean Review and PAIN, AMSA, et cetera. So to try to maybe touch upon a few of the issues that have come up here. With respect to some of the marine protected areas, we recognize that this is a difficult subject and how to address it. And so one of the things that we've done because of AMSA, there were 2 recommendations in it. One was to identify culturally and biologically significant areas. So we've gone ahead and started doing that. The biologically significant areas have already been identified, and there's a report on that that's waiting to be finalized, because we're unfortunately waiting for the cultural side, which is a little bit slower to come along. But once we have that, that also sets the stage for the second AMSA recommendation, which is then to try to look at how we can protect some of these areas from shipping. So I recognize this isn't sort of holistic protection and management, but at least it does look at one of the greatest threats right now, which is the shipping component. And it is limited at least to the high seas. It doesn't preclude governments submitting ideas to the Arctic Council within their own national jurisdiction, but it is focused on the high seas. And the Arctic Council will not be the body that actually takes the regulatory power. That's for the International Maritime Organization, as we heard, since they have those capabilities to set up some protective measures. Where else? What else do you want to hear about?
Maybe you could answer Jim's question and talk about the Arctic Council's role.
As a scientific
About
advisor.
Sure,
scientific
that was one I was
advisory.
Yes, okay, so that is in one of the chapters that David didn't really dwell on, though, is also looking at science. So this is an idea that has crossed our minds, at least to start identifying what scientific bodies exist, because there are some that exist for the Arctic region, but they tend to be a little bit disparate. There's science related to NEAF, to the fisheries body. There's some other science bodies as well, and so we're trying to sort of get the landscape of where they all are, where they operate, are they fragmented, and could there be a way to try to get that to be more holistic? So there isn't necessarily a formula that's been developed yet about how that can be done, but it is out there in terms of the Arctic Ocean Review to try to review what are the different